Welcome to the deep dive. Today we're really getting into the complexities of combat-related PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder.
Yeah, and we've got some interesting sources lined up. There's a cognitive behavioral therapy manual specifically for combat trauma, and also a big systematic review looking at, well, the effectiveness of different medications.
Right, two quite different angles.
Ah,
The CBT manual gives you that sort of hands-on psychological toolkit.
yeah,
While the review looks broadly at the medication side, the evidence for it.
exactly. And our goal, our mission for this deep dive is to pull out the key insights from both. We want to give you a really solid understanding of what combat PTSD involves and the different ways people approach managing it.
Okay, let's dive in then. So while we're focusing quite a bit on combat experiences today, it's probably worth saying upfront that a lot of what we'll talk about, especially thinking about the underlying mechanisms and coping skills, can apply to PTSD from other kinds of trauma too. The pharmacology review even included studies on different trauma types.
That's a really crucial point. The specific event might differ, but the way trauma can impact the brain and body shares common ground. We see this with classical conditioning, which is fundamental here.
Ah, like Pavlov's dogs, right, where a neutral thing, like a bell.
Exactly. Becomes linked with something meaningful, like food, and then the bell itself causes the reaction salivation in that case.
And the CBT manual mentions that little Albert experiment too, with the white rat and the loud noise. It shows how fear can be learned, how something neutral gets associated with something scary.
Precisely. And in PTSD, this learning process can kind of get hijacked by the traumatic event. Things that were just there during the trauma suddenly become powerful triggers.
About everyday things.
Yeah, absolutely. The manual gives some really stark combat examples. Maybe a specific location, certain sounds, explosions, sure, but maybe also alarms or even men screaming. Smells too, like burning fuel or materials. Even the feeling of riding in a certain type of vehicle.
Wow. So those things, later on, can just instantly bring back the fear and anxiety associated with the original event,
Exactly. They become conditioned stimuli, triggering that intense emotional and physical response.
which connects to the fight or flight response the manual talks about, that whole survival instinct.
Absolutely. It's your body's natural alarm system kicking in. Heart races, breathing gets shallow and fast, you might sweat, muscles tense up, all designed to help you survive immediate danger.
But the problem in PTSD is that this response gets triggered by those conditioned stimuli,
Yeah.
even when there's no actual danger present, right?
Right. And experiencing those intense physical sensations, the racing heart, the breathlessness when there's no obvious threat, can be terrifying in itself. It can feel like you're losing control, like having a panic attack.
And these triggers can spread, can't they? The manual calls it generalization.
Yeah, that's right. So someone who experienced gunfire might later react strongly to fireworks, or maybe a door slamming shut, or even a book dropping loudly. The brain starts reacting to things that are just similar to the original trigger.
It's like the threat detection system becomes overly sensitive.
That's a good way to put it. Which brings us nicely to a core idea in CBT, something the manual really emphasizes.
Which is,
That our emotions aren't directly caused by events themselves, but more by our thoughts and beliefs about those events.
okay, so it's the interpretation layer. It's not just what happened, but what we tell ourselves about what happened.
Exactly. And the manual talks about cognitive errors or distortions in thinking. These are like unhelpful thinking habits that can really amplify negative emotions.
Can you give some examples of those, especially in the context of PTSD?
Sure. The manual lists things like constantly feeling unsafe in public, maybe scanning crowds for threats even when things are calm, or a really specific one, seeing something ordinary by the road like a piece of trash and having the immediate thought that could be a bomb, even when you're back home, far from a combat zone.
Those sound incredibly stressful and, well, exhausting to live with.
They really are, and they fuel that cycle of anxiety and fear.
So CBT aims to tackle these thoughts directly. Not just manage the anxiety, but change the thinking behind it.
Precisely. It's about developing what the manual calls corrective thinking, actively challenging those alarming or unrealistic thoughts and replacing them with more balanced, realistic alternatives.
How does that work in practice? Say, with the example of feeling unsafe in a restaurant.
Well, instead of just accepting the feeling of I'm not safe here, you'd start questioning it. Like, okay, what's the actual evidence I'm in danger right now? Has anything bad ever happened to me in this restaurant? What's the real probability something terrible will happen?
So examining the likelihood and the actual evidence rather than just going with the gut fear feeling.
Exactly. It's about bringing in rational assessment to counter the emotionally driven thought. and often that can significantly dial down the anxiety.
The manual mentions a tool for this, right? A thought-challenging record.
Yes, it's a structured way to do this. You basically write down the situation, the emotion you felt, the specific thought that came up, the distorted one, and then you consciously work out a more realistic, helpful alternative thought. It makes the process very concrete.
That sounds really practical. And does this tie into the behavioral side of things like avoidance?
Absolutely, they're closely linked. The manual explains how avoidance, like staying away from places that trigger memories, or refusing to talk about the trauma, or isolating yourself, might feel better in the short term.
But it keeps the PTSD going.
Exactly. It prevents you from learning that those triggers or situations might actually be safe now. The same goes for what the manual calls safety aids.
Like always needing to sit near an exit or only going out with someone specific.
Yeah, those behaviors might reduce anxiety momentarily, but they reinforce the underlying belief that the situation is dangerous and you need these precautions. It prevents disconfirmation of the fear.
There's also that concept of fear incubation. What's that about?
That's when someone encounters a trigger, starts feeling anxious, and immediately leaves or escapes the situation. That escape provides relief, which actually strengthens the link between the trigger and the panic. Your brain learns, trigger, danger, escape is necessary.
Ah, okay. So leaving too soon actually makes it worse in the long run.
It can, yeah. Which is why a core part of CBT for PTSD is exposure therapy.
Right. Facing the fear, essentially.
In a very specific, gradual way, it's about systematically confronting those triggers, memories, situations, sensations, in a safe, controlled manner so the conditioned fear response can gradually weaken or extinguish.
It's not just throwing someone in the deep end, though. The manual talks about a hierarchy.
Yes, that's crucial.
Yeah.
You create a list of triggers, ranked from least anxiety-provoking to most. You start practicing exposure with the milder ones and only move up the ladder as you feel more comfortable and the anxiety response lessens.
Like the example of fearing dogs, maybe starting with pictures, then videos, then seeing one from afar.
Exactly, that kind of gradual progression. And the key, as the manual stresses, is staying in the situation during exposure until the anxiety naturally starts to decrease on its own.
Not escaping when it peaks.
Right. You need to ride out the wave of anxiety to break that fear incubation cycle and allow your brain to learn that the trigger doesn't actually lead to catastrophe.
And there are different types of exposure, imaginal and in vivo.
Yeah. Imaginal exposure involves vividly recalling and processing the traumatic memory in your mind, often guided by a therapist. In vivo exposure means confronting feared situations or stimuli in real life, again, gradually and repeatedly.
Okay, that gives a good sense of the CBT approach. Now let's shift gears a bit and look at the other source, the systematic review on medications. What did that tell us about pharmacological treatments for PTSD?
Well, the big picture from the review is complicated. It showed that while medications are widely used, the evidence for their effectiveness isn't always straightforward.
How so? What were the issues?
The major challenge highlighted was the quality of many studies. The review pointed out methodological limitations, things like unclear ways participants were randomized into groups, whether people knew who was getting the real drug versus placebo, blinding, how dropouts were handled, things like that.
So weaknesses in the study designs make it hard to be really confident about the results.
Pretty much. These issues, what they call risk of biases, cloud the picture and make it difficult to draw firm conclusions about how well many of these medications truly work compared to placebo or other treatments.
Okay. Did the review look at specific drugs? Were any highlighted as potentially more promising, even with those caveats?
It covered quite a few, yeah. Some used alone, some as add-ons. Things like risperidone to Pyramid, citalopram, prazosin, quite a list.
Any standouts?
Prazosin seemed to show some potential benefit, especially for reducing trauma-related nightmares, which can be really disruptive.
Okay, that's interesting.
But the review also stressed caution, pointing out side effects like potential drops in blood pressure, dizziness, stuff like that. So it needs careful prescribing and monitoring.
Makes sense. Did the review compare medication directly against psychotherapy, like the CBT we've been discussing?
It looked for those studies, but found relatively limited high-quality evidence directly comparing the two. And even in the studies that existed, there were often challenges.
What?
Like variations in the type and amount of therapy people received, making it hard to compare apples to apples. So ultimately, the review concluded there wasn't strong evidence to definitively say one specific evidence-based medication was better than another in head-to-head trials, or necessarily superior to therapy overall based on the available data.
So it really underscores that there's no single magic bullet, and treatment often needs to be personalized, possibly combining approaches.
That seems to be a fair takeaway. It highlights the complexity.
Now, going back to the CBT manual, it also talks about what happens after therapy seems to be working, maintaining progress, preventing relapse.
Yeah, that's a really important part. Just because you're feeling better doesn't mean the work stops entirely. The manual emphasizes continuing to practice the coping skills you've learned.
Like flexing a muscle to keep it strong.
Kinda, yeah. And it also normalizes the idea of having a lapse, maybe some symptoms briefly return. It stresses that this is common and doesn't automatically mean you're back to square one.
That's probably reassuring to hear. Does it mention things that might trigger a lapse?
It does. Things like encountering a situation very similar to the original trauma context, or what they call spontaneous recovery, where symptoms just seem to pop back up after a period of improvement, or unfortunately, experiencing a new traumatic event.
So what's the advice if symptoms do reappear?
Keep perspective. Remember, lapses can be temporary. Re-engage those coping skills, the thought challenging, maybe some gradual exposure if needed. And importantly, reach out for support, whether it's a therapist, support group, or trusted friend. Don't just try to white-knuckle it alone.
That makes sense. The manual also had sections on other coping strategies, didn't it? Beyond the core CBT stuff.
It did, yeah. It covered relaxation techniques quite well. Things like meditation, mindfulness, deep abdominal breathing, progressive muscle relaxation. Tools to help manage that baseline stress and arousal.
And exercise.
Yes, regular physical activity was highlighted for reducing stress and that kind of constant on-edge feeling. And sleep hygiene, too.
Ah, sleep is a big one for PTSD, isn't it?
Huge. So the manual gives practical tips. Avoiding naps, trying to keep a regular sleep-wake schedule, creating a calming bedtime routine. Basic stuff, but often overlooked and really impactful.
What about anger? That comes up a lot, too.
Yep. Anger can definitely be a symptom. The manual gives some quick tips for managing it in the moment, getting some distance, taking a time out, trying to shift perspective.
And dissociation. That feeling of being disconnected.
Address that too. Suggested grounding exercises, focusing on your senses, naming things you can see, hear, touch to bring yourself back to the present moment.
It also touched on guilt, which must be incredibly complex in combat situations.
Very complex. Survivor's guilt, guilt over actions taken or not taken. The manual acknowledges this and advises taking things at your own pace when processing those feelings, ideally with support.
And lastly, it mentioned substance use.
Yeah, specifically acknowledging that things like alcohol might be used to try and numb feelings or cope, but highlighting the serious risks dependence, making other problems worse. It also noted the risks of benzodiazepines, even if prescribed potential for dependence and rebound anxiety.
Okay, so pulling this all together from our deep dive today,
Mhm.
what are the main takeaways?
Well, I think we've seen how PTSD, especially from combat, involves these learned fear responses, almost like the brain's wiring gets altered by the trauma, linking neutral things to intense fear through conditioning.
And we saw how CBT tackles this head-on, focusing on how our thoughts and beliefs shape our emotions, and using tools like thought challenging and gradual exposure to change those patterns.
Right. It's about actively retraining the brain, in a sense. Then the pharmacology review gave us that other perspective, the potential role of medication in managing symptoms like nightmares or overall anxiety.
But with the important caveat about the current evidence base having limitations and the need for careful consideration and often a combined approach.
Exactly. And finally, the importance of ongoing effort, maintaining skills, understanding that lapses can happen, and having strategies ready to prevent a full relapse.
It really paints a picture of a multifaceted condition requiring a multifaceted approach. Considering how tightly linked the psychological experience and the body's physical responses are in PTSD, it really makes you wonder.
What's next?
Yeah. What are the most promising directions for future research? How can we better integrate these different approaches, psychological, pharmacological, maybe even others, for truly holistic treatment and long-term recovery?
That's the big question, isn't it? There's still so much to learn. But hopefully this deep dive today has given you, our listeners, a clearer, more foundational understanding, whether you're listening for yourself, for someone you care about, or for professional reasons.
We hope exploring these sources, the CBT manual and the medication review, has been insightful. Gaining knowledge is such a crucial first step. We really encourage you to keep exploring these ideas.